The UFC is creating fake stars. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'll get into that throughout the course of this video, but let's go over how they're creating the fake stars and, why are they doing it with fighters and media and pretty much everything around the sport. So, to summarize, by fake stars, I mean not that these people aren't popular or say more popular than the average UFC fighter, but there's some fighters you can tell who are organically very popular, and you can tell there are some fighters who are very artificially being pushed by the UFC for one reason or another. And now, I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples on both sides. I would say someone like, well, not a specific person, but the group of the fighting nerds are a much more organic set of stars, or at the very least, big names in the sport compared to, say, bot Nickal. So, with fighters, I think what we're seeing is the UFC push a lot of fighters who maybe they deserve it, maybe they don't. It's been a fairly new experiment. It's tough to say how often the UFC is going to get it right with these stars that they're trying to push and how often they're total flops, because they've simply not done it with a lot of people yet. I think the two most obvious examples are Bo Nickal and Sean O'Malley. Now, Sean O'Malley, I think it's fair to say, was a success. He did touch gold. He didn't defend it, at least not against a legitimate contender. But hey, I'm not going to discount the Aljo win. I do think that is a very legitimately good win. But you can obviously see how pushed Sean O'Malley was by UFC brass. When you look through a lot of his early career, he was just being fed cans over and over and over, so they could keep building him all these highlight reel KOs and often putting him on pay-per-views and such, even before he was ranked and things like that, or had ever beat anyone any good. And then they jump him right through the rankings all the way to a #1 contender match that we don't have to get into it. You can say he won, you can say Jan won, it could have absolutely gone either way, and then to the title shot, and then gets gifted a free title defense against Marlon Chito Vera. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of bias there. And then you could just see it with how the UFC like to talk about Sean O'Malley. You always see, especially with the couple of cards that he headlined, the UFC's going on and on about how he's a superstar, he's transcending the sport, he's so super cool and awesome and all these things. But I would make the argument, if he's a superstar, you don't need to keep telling us he's a superstar. The other good example of a fighter the UFC is seemingly trying to artificially push is Bo Nickal, and there's seemingly a lot more pushback against Bo Nickal compared to Sean O'Malley. I think it's really only more hardcore fans who were calling out O'Malley, whereas even casuals are kind of having enough of Bo Nickal. Since, of course, again, he's been fed nothing but cans up until the Paul Craig fight, but let's be honest, Paul Craig's nothing that amazing either. He's just fluked some wins over good competition. But despite that, you see Bo Nickal keeps getting put on main cards of pay-per-views over and over and over, including the largest, most insane pay-per-view of all time in UFC 300. He gets put on the main card, and he just slows the momentum of the card right down to a halt with an awful fight against Cody Brundage. But it's same thing here, after his Paul Craig win recently, he goes on the mic about how it's a dominant performance, and you have all of the UFC brass and commentators hyping him up during the fight and after the fight, when it was a reasonably competitive fight. It was both of them kind of just standing around having a light sparring match. And then you have everyone in the UFC going, wow, Bo Nickal, man, he's something else. Ridiculous. And at least this time, you're seeing regular UFC fans are catching on to this stuff. You started hearing people chant overrated during his, I can't remember if it was the end of the fight or if it was during his interview. And these are just casual fans who were in the audience. These aren't people who are probably spending hours every day sitting on MMA guru streams. And how are they creating fake stars with the media? Well, this time we have one example, and that's Nina Drama. But essentially what they do here is they let someone get very close to Dana and the UFC brass and all these important fighters and let them do a bunch of content with the UFC, giving them lots of interviews, and other such things. And of course, this means that once you're let in nice and tight, you're never going to say anything bad about the UFC if they made your career, such as the example with Nina Drama. So of course, these types of people are never going to criticize the UFC for things like making unfair, or maybe not unfair, but undeserved title shots, as I talked about in my last video. Go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. They're not going to call the UFC out for that. They're not going to call the UFC out for fighter pay, any of those sort of things. I mean, you saw this Ariel Helwani. He's of course never at any UFC events because he pushes back on Dana, but he's of course still a big enough name that he still does get fighter interviews, but he's just not being gifted them in the same way as someone like Nina Drama. Essentially, we're seeing this new brand of UFC media person who's really a UFC-themed social media influencer rather than an actual sports journalist. And I imagine the UFC will pop up more people like Nina in the future. So why do I think both these things are happening? Well, let's go over the fighters. You know, naturally you do want stars to sell pay-per-views. That makes the UFC more money. Naturally, it makes sense why the UFC would try and push certain people. But why do they choose these specific people? Well, again, I think they have good reasons for it. You know, they are trying to do their best to pick people who have good accolades or are exciting, all these sort of things. You know, like someone like Sean O'Malley. Yes, he's being fed cans, but hey, he was still putting up entertaining knockouts over those cans, so fair enough. The Bo Nickal one, I get that he's some, like, legendary wrestler. I probably sounded very ignorant there because I don't know anything about wrestling, but I don't know why they keep pushing him so hard when he's really not done anything that great in the UFC, and looks like he would get horribly fraud-checked by anyone in the top 15. But hey, you're not gonna hit 100 every single time, so we'll have to see what the UFC's, you know, success rate is with these fake stars in the future. I think the biggest thing though is they seem to always want to try and push the Dana White Contender Series guys so that they can funnel more and more people through only coming in through Dana White's Contender Series. Maybe it's an ego thing because, you know, it has Dana's name on it. Who knows? But I think the other thing is that it allows the UFC to control these fighters because these fighters wouldn't really be anything if the UFC didn't give them so many nice, easy matchups. Imagine the UFC was just giving Sean O'Malley pressure-heavy wrestlers like Merab early on in his career and didn't give him a free title defense. Well, obviously then Sean O'Malley is going to be a lot less loyal to the UFC. But when he owes everything to the UFC, really pushing him and giving him all these nice, easy matchups and all those sort of things, that of course makes him loyal to the UFC, which means, again, not going to call it the UFC. He's not going to rebel against the UFC like someone like Francis Ngannou did, who's of course a natural MMA star. So the idea is same thing when you look at like Conor McGregor. He got so big, transcended the sport, that all of a sudden he was able to stand up to the UFC. He was like, well, I want to do the boxing. And they had no choice but to really let him do the boxing. And I don't think the UFC likes that. They don't like that there are fighters out there who can tell the UFC what to do. The UFC wants to tell the fighter what to do. And so by creating loyalty, by pushing someone and manufacturing them into a star, well, you can see how that would all work. You're not going to see Sean O'Malley go and do a bunch of rebellious things like Francis Ngannou or Conor McGregor, because he owes everything to the UFC. And same thing with Bo Nickal if he is actually going to turn out to be anything good. And same thing, the media, we already kind of touched on this, but really, if you're a social media influencer, had your career built by the UFC, you're never going to ask the hard questions because you'd be betraying the company that made you. So you're going to ensure that the UFC is never going to be asked hard questions. So guess what? Once a journalist hints about monopolizing MMA, fighter pay, or anything remotely resembling a scandal with the UFC, they're going to get banished and replaced by yet another UFC-made social media influencer. So all in all, I think we're going to see more and more fighters being treated like Sean O'Malley and Bo Nickal, as well as media people like Nina Drama, because the UFC is trying to artificially create stars, but not ones that outgrow the sport like Conor did. So how do they do that? To summarize, they're taking fun prospects, giving them free highlight reel knockouts, while they work on their skills, let them skip the line to a #1 contenders fight, and if all that works out, they win that, and they win the title, and become a star that's always going to be loyal to the UFC, because they were pushed by the UFC and didn't push themselves, meaning they'll never outgrow the UFC, meaning the UFC will never have to play their rules. So comment down below what you think about all this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.